Today's podcast is brought to you by the Monkey Method app. This is an app brought to you by Power Monkey, and what we've done with this app is really exciting. We're really proud of it. Something we've been working on for a number of years. It basically allows for skill development plans to be put into place in one easy to follow along format. We have over 1,200 videos in there that are free to access. Even if you don't buy one of the plans, they're always there in the palm of your hand, very easily accessible technique videos. Along with that, we have a bunch of gymnastics and weightlifting plans in there that are all assessment based. So it's not a one size fits all plan. You can go in there, do the assessment, and figure out what category, what level you are based in according to what your starting point looks like. You'll have a tailored program, something that's a little bit more individualized. I'm really proud of it and hope you guys take advantage of it. Hey everyone, welcome to another Power Monkey podcast. Today's episode is just me and Chad. We're going to be talking about breaking down, giving some nuance and some better understanding to the handstand push-up. Chad will be kind of asking me some questions, and we delve into some really deep questions with the handstand push-up. And to be honest, we spoke for an hour on this, and we didn't even cover everything. So it's a really good, interesting podcast if you're interested and wanting to learn more about handstand push-ups. So hope you guys enjoy it.
All right, handstand push-ups. I love handstand push-ups, Dave. Probably one of the things in CrossFit for me personally that I have the most capacity in. Strangely enough, even more than like a snatch or a clean and jerk. Those are the things that I kind of hate to do the most in CrossFit workouts because they're tough. But I've got a pretty strong handstand push-up. I can't beat you, Dave, but certainly. But I'm excited for this recording. And I've heard you talk a lot about handstand push-ups through the years, of course, taking some pointers from you, but not quite as much as hearing you talk about handstand, the handstand. So what I want to know first is, do you see the handstand as the base of a handstand push-up, or rather should someone be working on their handstand and trying to perfect that as much as they possibly can, get that, what you talk about is strength and position and stability to kind of get those things under control with the handstand to bleed into their handstand push-up?
Yeah, so obviously having a strong handstand is going to benefit your handstand push-up. I think that should be kind of a no-brainer for most people. If your handstand is poor, anything that you're trying to do on top of a handstand is also going to be poor. So that's something right off the bat that needs to be kind of mentioned. The handstand definitely needs to be solid, similar with like handstand walking. You can't have a good handstand walk if you don't have a good handstand first. And we can definitely go into that area on another podcast. But really, I look at it as three different kind of breakdowns. To have a good handstand push-up, you need to have a good handstand. You need to have a good headstand, which is a really missed and glossed over point. And you need to have a good pushing position and making sure you're activating correctly in your pushing position. And those things might seem obvious to some people, but really those, especially the secondary two, because most people will kick up to the handstand much more often than they work on their push positioning. And almost no one works on their headstand positioning, which is really critical. And in a lot of ways, I recommend people working on their headstand prior to working on their handstand, because one, if you can't do it on 3 points, don't expect to be able to do it on 2 points. And also we work on headstands in gymnastics world before we learn handstands. So it's one of those, it's kind of, to me, a precursor to getting inverted correctly on a handstand is really bettering your headstand. So those three to me are really all important when you're actually trying to increase your capacity, increase your ability when it comes to handstand push-up.
Yeah, Dave. And that's the thing, is that I don't think it is extremely obvious to everyone, or when you put it that way so simply, it is like, you're like, oh yeah, it is. But at the same time, it's so easy for people to skip over those things. It's so easy to kick up against the wall. And if you're capable of doing handstand push-ups against the wall and never, ever even work on your handstand at all, aside from being up against the wall, and it's at the end of your handstand push-up. And to me, it's the same. Again, we always like relating gymnastics to weightlifting movements. It's the same base, or what I would call the base of a squat, is you perfecting your bottom position. I think that's very comparable to what you would say is the base of your handstand push-up, is getting the lockout or the handstand position of your handstand push-up prepared and strong as much as possible. Now, I want to take this into just a basic push-up. And, I wonder, I've never asked you this or heard you say this before, but do you feel like for someone to be able to do a good push-up, meaning, hands about shoulder width apart, elbows staying into the side and having good capacity with that execution of a good push-up, and also being able to keep their body in line without arching and all that stuff, do you feel like that is a prerequisite? So if someone is always doing a push-up with their hands really wide and those elbows flaring out, and they're never doing it any different or working on doing it different, are they ever going to be able to do an elbow in, shoulder width apart handstand push-up?
It should be an obvious answer, but absolutely not. They're never going to be able to do it. And this is, to me, one of the most missed opportunities when it comes to a lot of different areas that I see missing. People don't do enough push work, and it starts with a good, solid, correct, standard push-up. And that's going to translate to a better dip. It's going to translate to a better strict press overhead. It's going to translate to a better handstand push-up. And if you're doing poor push-ups consistently, it's going to translate into poor position with those higher level skills as well. So one of the things I will generally say whenever I'm teaching, whenever I'm working with people on handstand push-ups, one of the first things that I'll always mention is that working on more standard push-ups and improving technique and muscle and correct muscle activation with the push-up is going to translate into so many other things. So I always recommend that people start working on push-ups much more regularly. It's one of the things that I did daily as part of my gymnastics training. I would always end my gymnastics session. The last thing I did every single day was 3 sets of push-ups every single day. Now, the push-ups would vary in terms of the difficulty and what variation I did. Sometimes I would do what we call Maltese push-ups. Maltese push-ups even have difficulty in terms of their variations. I would do ball push-ups. I would do standard, depending on what the day called for. But I would always end with 3 sets of 35 push-ups. And that was just the number that me and my coach kind of came up with. And and it wasn't really anything to overly fatigue at that point. Doing 100 and whatever push-ups was fairly easy for me, but it was more just to kind of reinforce that muscle activation, reinforce the position, reinforce the importance of pushing, so that I would constantly have it in my head that, okay, I know this pattern inside and out. And that's another thing that's really important. It's not only building the correct muscle group activation, like getting that muscle strong, it's also the pattern that we're trying to get across. The more reps you do, and I think this is very similar with anything, you want people to be taking the load off the bar and working with basically no weight to kind of work on their snatch pattern or work on their clean pattern. The more you can get your body to understand what the pattern's supposed to feel like, your body will naturally start to take over time. And if you've taught your body poor position and poor technique time and time again, that's what your body's going to revert to. So a lot of times I'll have people kind of do handstand push-ups. Okay, I want to see really great position. Keep the elbows in, really tricep heavy activation. I want to make sure you're doing it correctly. First couple reps look great, and then all of a sudden after a few reps, their elbows are out, hands are turned out. They're doing much more heavily activated front part of the shoulder. Why is that happening? They know they need to stay in. It's happening because they've built this pattern in their body for doing poor reps for so long that as soon as fatigue sets in, they revert exactly back to what they're accustomed doing. So what we want to do is try to give them a pattern that's correct from a technical perspective, so that as fatigue sets in, they revert back to good technique and a good pattern, which is going to create more efficiency. So what we need to be doing is starting with a good push-up. If the good push-up has a pattern in place that is correct, once fatigue sets in, they will consistently revert back to good technique, good efficiency, and it'll lead to more output. So for me, a standard push-up is something that every single one of our listeners need to be doing more of. And I would highly recommend doing it. If it's new for you and it's not something you're super strong at, do them from your knees, do them at an angle, simplify the position, simplify the difficulty of the movement pattern, but do it in a way that allows you to make sure that your elbows are tucked in, they're riding along your lats. You don't want those triceps touching along your lats. And one of the keys is making sure that you have a lot of tricep activation. It's one of the things I kind of glossed over just mentioning it. But if you're only feeling the front part of the shoulders working, something is missing. It should be feeling like your triceps are fatiguing on you a ton. That's why you really need a lot of tricep strength to do a good pushing action correctly, and that'll translate to a better handstand push-up as well.
Now, you recommend that in general that people do a lot of push-ups, and that seems to me you're saying whether you're capable of doing a handstand push-up or not. If you are capable of doing a handstand push-up, especially strict, this is an action that you can perform that can just reinforce that good pattern. If you're hopefully doing it with a good pattern, and if you're not capable of a handstand push-up, then maybe you should be doing, correct me if I'm wrong, more standard push-ups to help as something that can help develop the strength and awareness of the proper movement there. But the big thing that you talk about all the time, Dave, is keeping those elbows in and using your triceps. So it's obviously critical that if they're doing a lot of these push-ups, that they are doing them with their elbows in. Now, what are some of the tricks that you have to use, that you've had to develop or come up with? Because I know surely you've had to help people keep their elbows in on a push-up. And along with that, I think some of it is where they're putting their hands as well. So can we talk about hand position on push-up and some of the tricks that you've used or to help them do that? And are they missing anything strength-wise, or is there some sort of imbalance that is leading them to that, aside from it just being their muscle memory that they're used to?
So I think one question in there that I would like to address first is just the hand positioning, because I think hand position is pretty important. It translates like to your handstands and to a lot of other positions that you're going to be doing in support, in plank, inverted. What we're looking for is a position that's going to allow, especially when we're working towards handstands, where the hands are going to be shoulder width apart. And if you've ever heard me talk about handstands before in terms of positioning and setup, you'll always hear me talk about middle finger being to the outside of the shoulder in terms of our optimal position. And that's going to be standard for where we are in a plank, where we are in a handstand, where we are in support, how we hang from the bar, from the rings. We're always going to be thinking about middle finger to the outside of the shoulder. That's going to be our proper shoulder width position. Now, the direction of the fingertips matters pretty considerably when we're applying it to a handstand as well. So if we're thinking about this in terms of the handstand itself, I want us to be working towards a position where the index finger, potentially even the middle finger, are facing at 12 o'clock, so facing out in front of you. Excuse me. What that's going to allow for is for you to actually be able to grip the ground and be able to control what's going on and create more stability through those hands. If your hands are turned out considerably, which is where most people will go when they're kicking up to handstand up against the wall and doing handstand push-ups, it's going to limit your ability to work towards higher level versions of that movement. And no matter what we are doing, no matter what skill we're training, we're always thinking about the position in its more simplified version to be set up and prepared for the highest level version of that movement, if that makes sense. I always want people to have their technique in place so that they can work towards the highest level version of that movement through a series of building strength and building the movement pattern and getting more confident. If you are doing a really poor position with the simplified movement, there is no way that's going to translate into the higher level skill. So really, we're always trying to set the standard in terms of movement quality around what is going to be needed as the person kind of, checks off boxes saying, okay, I can do a good push-up. How does that translate to a downward dog handstand push-up or a pike or an elevated handstand push-up, freestanding handstand push-up, deficit freestanding handstand push-up, ring free handstand push-up one day? And what needs to happen in terms of me being able to kind of work through that pattern? And hand position in the plank is actually very important to be able to kind of work through that. So I really want the hands to be kind of working in that direction. Now, a lot of times the reason why that's not possible is because of someone's wrist issues. If your wrists are very immobile, if your wrists are very weak, the tendency is to turn out so that you can actually get into a more comfortable position where your wrist is not put in such a severe position from that angle. So if that's the case, I want you to consider more wrist-specific exercises. You can eventually work towards a better position in the same way that, you're trying to get someone's feet to be properly positioned for something like a squat. Same idea. How do we get that person to be able to move their hands so that they can move into a more efficient position? Now, it's going to take a long time if someone's wrists are very immobile. One of the things I will highly recommend and kind of fits, I know some other people, after doing some research on it, have some tools out there that kind of simulate and do the same thing. But I kind of came to this before ever finding those other resources, and I came to it after working with you and Mike and a lot of Olympic weightlifters. In the same way that you guys use lifters to give yourself a little bit of elevation in your heel to help with position,
Right.
especially in some deep squats and things like that, how it helps get into a better position if you don't have the anchor mobility of the knee or the hip. Give some elevation to the palm of your hand. So what I have people do if they're not able to get into a good hand position because of some limitations in their wrist is just put their hand onto a little elevated surface, whether that be, a little piece of wood or a change plate or a handstand wedge. We have just little wedges that you can kind of prop the palm of your hand up onto to kind of get that hand into a better position. It will allow you to kind of feel where those fingertips need to be to get more comfortable with proper position. Then over time, take some of that height out of the way and get your hand fully flat onto the ground. So I think we just need to apply some tools that maybe you're using in the Olympic weightlifting world and do them into the gymnastics world. And it'll help people kind of get into that better position in terms of hand placement.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you're using, I guess I would say elevated palms. To help people, learn better positioning in handstand push-ups. It's the exact same thing that I do every single day with, to try to help people squat better with more quality, and then ultimately receive a snatch and clean a little bit better. And so you're saying that you would do that with a push-up as well if their hands have a tendency to turn out, because I think the angles when someone goes down for a handstand push-up, correct me if I'm wrong, as far as the angle in the forearm would be the same in the bottom position of a push-up.
Yeah. So the push-up, most cases, it's less severe, the angle, because people's shoulders will be either directly on top or slightly behind. But the handstand, especially if you're doing back-to-wall handstand, the weight is pulling you past vertical, which means that you're in a much more severe angle at that wrist position. And obviously your weight is inverted, so it's much more on top of the wrist. It's a much more severe, a much more heavy load on top of those wrists than when you're in a plank. So we don't see the need to put the elevated palm in place as much in a plank. But if you feel like you need to turn your hands out, even in a plank, and your wrists are that severe in terms of needing work, then go ahead, put some elevated palm action, even just when you're doing push-ups or when you're doing something in plank. The other thing I would recommend is doing them on parallettes. And this is another variation, and then that again will allow you to work towards higher level versions. So not only doing them straight on, but also doing in parallettes. What that does, it turns the hands out slightly, but you're able to grip. So a couple things happen there. One, that changing into more of a palm facing each other position, what it does is it puts your wrists into a much more neutral position. So it's not as severe as if your hands were flat down on the ground. So if you have wrist issues, I normally recommend people doing them on parallettes because it helps in terms of taking off some of the pressure on the wrists. But what it also does, it helps put the person in a position that would mimic what they would be doing if they were on parallel bars. We can turn out even more if they were thinking about trying to do them on rings or something like that. So doing them on parallettes will mimic, again, some of the variations that they'll be seeing at a higher level, and also take some of the severity off of the wrist.
Yeah, and what I like about turning the hands that way, like on parallettes or rings, is it helps force the elbows into the side. So and I've had athletes do this before where I've tried to get them, on parallettes or to position their hand in such a way specifically to help teach them to keep their elbows into their side. But for some of them, that's not enough. So what is it for you that they're missing, and what can we do for those people that they are the extreme case of, okay, we're trying to play this trick with you and turn your hands in this way on parallettes for a few reasons, and one specifically being to keep the elbows in. What is it that they're missing, and what can we do to help them to develop that?
This is a really good question, and I want people to really ask more questions if it doesn't make sense, my answer here. This is a little tricky, all right, because what we're talking about with parallettes translates specifically to what we want to be seeing on parallel bars or rings. So if you think about it, if I'm having the person grab onto something and externally rotate from the hand, turning out, that's mimicking the same type of position that we'd be seeing on rings and parallel bars, which is really advantageous in terms of keeping the elbows in. However, if we're doing the same thing with our hands flat down on the ground, and you're telling them, okay, we're thinking about externally rotating, and it's putting their hands facing out to be able to keep the elbows in, that's not correct. And that's not beneficial.
Right.
And what that's doing is it's working over and it's glossing over one of the real issues in terms of a good position flat down on the ground. So really there's two variations here. There's the one that's applying to having something in hand, and then there's the variation of having the hands flat in a handstand. And what ends up happening is, and this is one of the things that we see quite a bit, people turning their hands out when they're kicking up against the wall because of a limitation in the wrist, right? And yes, that might keep the elbow in naturally, but it's creating more of a problem from the ground up, right? So just like you would in an Olympic weightlifting world, we'll assess from the ground up. So if you're seeing good elbows but a poor hand position, we still have to address what's happening from the hand position. So normally what we see is the problem is I don't see enough, I call it kind of corkscrewing down through the ground, right? So when your hand is down on the ground, we want to be feeling like we're corkscrewing our entire arm down through the ground. We're creating an external rotation from the shoulder through the elbow, but the hand stays perfectly flat. So the way that we get the elbows to track in by the sides is not by turning the hand out when we're doing a handstand, but rather by rotating through the shoulder and getting the elbow to corkscrew, externally rotate, corkscrew through the ground. So then we can keep the pattern in place and not change the hand position. So that's slightly different in terms of the value and how it's being applied when you have something external in your hands like parallettes or rings, as opposed to when you're trying to do a handstand push-up when your hands are flat on the ground. So it's really important to note the application of those two different variations and what the elbow is trying to do. Yes, I want the elbow in, but the hand position needs to be in place according to the movement that you're trying to work towards.
Yeah, it's the handstand push-ups match up almost identically. There are a few slight things that we could pick out, but almost identically to the way that I want to perfect someone's squat. I'm always going to.
That's why I call them arm squats.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to do everything I possibly can to keep people's feet in the, I call it stance of greatest potential, right? Or the gold standard foot position for your squat. I'm always going to try to work up from that, and I'm always going to try to trick them, give them a cue or a mobility drill to where they can maintain that foot position, because that's the base. Everything is working up from that point, as you mentioned there, Dave. And what you're talking about with your hands in the position that you're recommending, middle finger straight ahead and right at the outside of the shoulders, you're talking about corkscrewing, and what that means is that I just want to make sure the listeners understand this. That means that the bend of the elbow is pointing forward as much as possible. It's like with foot position, to help people maintain that foot position and get their knees out better as they're squatting and ultimately get into a better squat. For a lot of athletes, I have to have them lock their knees and then twist their knees out as much as they can to help them maintain that foot position.
Yeah, similar corkscrewing action,
so,
right?
Yeah, basically the same corkscrewing action that we want to do there. Now, to have your hands in this position and to be able to move your elbows in the way that we want on a push-up is one thing, but it's a little more difficult doing a handstand push-up, right? So what I run into a lot, Dave, is, and because there's a lot of information out there, there's a lot of information that's put out, there's a lot of misconceptions or misinterpretations. And so what I hear a lot when I try to put out this gold standard for foot position is, well, I had this anatomical variation that says that I have to put my feet in this different position, or that I have to do my Olympic lifts in this way. And I just don't necessarily believe that's true. I do believe that there are anatomical variations, but just to throw out an example, with foot position on the squat, one of the major things that is assessed for anatomical variations is hip anatomy. And there are variations in hip anatomy, and there's a range of hip anatomy that we would call, say, normal, and there's outside of that range would be abnormal. So that means that most people, percentage wise, are going to fall into what is normal. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called normal, right? But what that says when your hips test abnormally, it actually doesn't say anything about specifically where the width of your feet should be. So that's a misinterpretation, misunderstanding. People, one of the go-to adjustments is to let's widen my feet and let's turn them out. And so it does say that one might be slightly more comfortable with a slight more turnout in their toes. But listen to what I just said there. It's only slight. It's not this. It's not that you should go from straight or a 5-degree turnout of your toe all the way to a 45-degree turnout. It says that maybe your gold standard instead of 5 degrees out is maybe 15 degrees out, right? So in the world of handstand push-ups, Dave, and handstand push-up, do you get people kind of immediately saying, hey, my anatomy is different?
Not so much when it comes to, most of the time the anatomy differences I see when it comes to handstand push-ups and handstands in general have to do with the elbows. The elbows being not capable of getting fully locked out. There's always a slight kink. We see this a lot actually when we're working with people that come from a pulling world, meaning someone that was either a rower or a grappler, a wrestler, someone that has constantly been kind of pulling something towards their midline their entire life. They're very, very tight in being able to, get full extension from that elbow. So they're constantly anatomically set up to not be able to get fully locked out from the elbow. So it's one of the things that we always have to assess. Is it, a natural occurrence that is just, like you say, anatomical, or is it something that's sport specific that we can potentially work on opening that position over and over again by, giving them drills to be able to get that to be open over time. Most of the time people are open to working on the changes. It's just frustrating because it takes a really long time, especially if you've done something for so long. It's really frustrating. And somebody says, especially higher level competitors, or sometimes even some of the hardest to change here, because they're good at the other variation and they're good at doing a wide finger out handstand push-up. And so they're like, why would I ever change this position if it's a position that's strong for me already? And what I tell them is that because they're going to be exposed to something that doesn't take into consideration the movement pattern that they're doing right now. And that's what they sometimes miss. And then there's a, oh shit moment when they have to do a freestanding handstand push-up, or when they have to do a variation where it forces them to have their fingers facing in the correct direction, or the elbows being in a particular direction. And they've never done a rep that way. And then they become exposed. What we're trying to do is prepare athletes for, from a competitive standpoint, preparing athletes for what they might be seeing coming down the pipeline, all right? A freestanding, we saw a ring handstand push-up in the games a couple of years ago. Like those kind of things, unless you understand really what's going on and how to tackle that correctly, standard handstand push-up that you're doing up against the wall is not really helping you. So we really need to understand kind of why the position is there, why it's beneficial, and how it's applying to other variations. But like I said, most people are generally open to it. It's just frustrating for them because it's challenging and because it's the kind of thing that takes a really long time to change once you have so many reps under your belt.
Yeah, absolutely. So to kind of confirm what I was getting at there, you would say that for them to be able to perform handstand push-ups or push-ups with the recommendations that you're giving, hand position, elbows in, the execution that you ideally want to see, are things that they can improve on over time versus, hey, this is just my anatomy and I'm never going to be able to do it that way.
Yes, absolutely. Like I do think that, there probably are some anatomical limitations in some movements, but for the most part, you can work through them if you're diligent enough and consistent enough with the accessory pieces that, we would recommend putting into your plan. And I think that's one of the things that most people also miss on. Technique is as important as consistency. They go hand in hand. They are one and the same, right? You cannot have technique and apply it one day a week and expect to see any change. You cannot consistently do poor technique and expect to see any change in the long run. You need technique to be understood, and it needs to be done consistently. And when we talk about consistently, that's something that needs further explanation as well. If you're in, a CrossFit type setting or working towards trying to become good at so many different movements, it becomes really challenging to do consistently, you know, my snatch every day, or my handstand push-up every day, or
Mm,
my muscle up every day. There are so many different things that you're trying to become good at that naturally you're going to have skipped sessions in a particular area. So
mm-hmm.
my goal is always to prioritize where the time needs to be spent. Where are your biggest efficiencies? How can we categorize and kind of target your training such that the consistency can be applied correctly to the areas of biggest deficiency? And that's such a key component here. Where does your time need to be spent so that we can be working on these areas consistently so that they can be starting to improve more regularly? So I would highly recommend people to, if you are diligent about that consistency and, you consider it more of an anatomical issue, that's your biggest limitation, those things can be fixed over time. It does take time. I'm not going to say that it's
Mm-hmm.
not going to happen overnight, but don't expect
Right.
change to happen if you're doing them 1 or 2 times a week. Don't expect them to change if you have poor technique while you're doing them 6 days a week. It needs to be done correctly and consistently if you want to really see that change over time.
Absolutely. And kind of going back to what you were saying about push-ups, maybe for you, that's, committing. I like to have people commit to a certain amount of time. Usually it's 4 weeks. I say, hey, commit to 4 weeks because I feel like that's a chunk of time that they can wrap their mind around and then reassess and either continue doing the same thing for another 4 weeks or make some adjustments. So, maybe that is just someone simply doing push-ups more frequently. Maybe I don't know what your recommendation would be, Dave. Would that be 3 days a week, 4 days a week, 5 days a week? 2 to 3 sets of 10 reps. What would that look like?
Yeah, and I think you're right on with that 4 week being a good marker for people. You want something that they can actually digest and say, okay, I can do this. I can stick to this for 4 weeks to be able to kind of see a change. And the difficulty, just to mention this because I think it's important, the difficulty on the gymnastic side is not really being able to see and visibly have the ability to kind of see the change and improvement the way that you can in Olympic weightlifting world. You can put a couple more kilos on the bar here and there and say, I know I am better. I can actually see my improvement from day 1 to day 2. Gymnastics is a little bit more nebulous, right? It's because it's position focused. There's not really a weight that you can throw on there to say, am I better than I was the last time I tried this? So one of the things that I would really highly recommend is adding more progressions. And this is one of the things that I think most people kind of miss out on. They'll say, okay, yeah, my push-ups are getting better. Let me go apply it to a handstand push-up. That's not the right next step. That's not the right next step.
Right.
There are so many different, we call them scaling options, but they're really progressions to the eventual movement. So what you want to do is take your really solid push-up and then apply it to maybe a downward dog or a pike handstand push-up, and then apply it to an elevated handstand push-up, and then apply it to, maybe an angled wall handstand push-up, and working on all of these different variations, kind of stepping stone by stepping stone, until you eventually get to the point where you're doing it at that highest level. It's not 0 to 100 and say, okay, I'm getting good at this
Right.
really simple variation. Now I can go apply it to, it's like, getting good at a squat with 95 pounds. And then the next week going, all right, I'm ready for, 405. Like, no, you're not even close. There are a million stepping stones along the way to be able to get to the point where you're doing it at that highest level or at that highest weight. So that's something I really want to get across, is the importance of taking this step by step and knowing, and that's why it's important to work with people who know what those progressions are. Having a really good understanding of what the progressions are supposed to look like, the more tools you have in your tool belt, is so important in feeling that you can take incremental baby steps going from part 1 to part 2 to part 3. Coaches who don't have the progressions in their tool belt will jump steps way too aggressively. They'll go from step 1 to step 10 to step 20 and miss out on all of these little incremental steps along the way to give people the ability to say, okay, I know that I'm working through this pattern in the correct progression. So for me, that's such a huge step. Now, in terms of consistency, it really depends on your starting point. It's really hard to kind of give just a general 6 days a week is going to be good for everybody, because some people just pushing strength is not there, and they just haven't done any of it. So I would say for someone that's starting from scratch, 3 days a week is a really good starting point, and it's actually what we normally recommend when we're putting plans together for our beginner plans. People that need a rest day in between each one to make sure that their muscle groups are kind of prepared for that next day's session. Building from 3 to 4, and eventually the consistency to me needs to be around 6 days a week. 5 on the low end, 6 on the optimal end, where you're actually seeing it. And that doesn't mean that you're going balls to the wall, going as hard as you possibly can those 6 days a week. You're probably doing heavy 4 days a week. And then the other days are maintenance days, or days where you're working on the movement pattern and you're getting those muscle groups to fire correctly, but in a much lesser of a load kind of a way. So to me, there are a few things that I want to see people doing that regularly, almost daily. More mobility, more core specific training, so they get that midline nice and strong, and then more handstand variations. When I tell people that, they always like, you want me to do handstands every day? And the thing I need to emphasize whenever I tell them that is that working on handstands does not mean that you need to be inverted. There are so many things that you can be doing for that handstand that can be done upright, or laying on your stomach, or laying on your back, or positional specific exercises that don't need to be fully inverted. And the same thing goes with, working on your push strength. You can be working hard on that push strength 4 days a week, but then you can be working on some positional exercises. You can be working on some other variations that get those triceps firing, that all have application and kind of transfer back to the push-up or the handstand push-up, but don't necessarily mean that it's the exact same pattern.
Yeah, frequency is so important with anything that someone wants to change or improve or get really good at. And I like to say that, doing 6 sets of 10 reps, for example, on whatever you're working on one day per week, is way less effective than you doing 1 set of 10 6 days a week. The frequency and the very regular exposure to that movement or to that mobility drill is far more important, spread out through the week, as opposed to just hammering yourself with a lot of work 1 day a week. That's not really going to do a whole lot for you. That's just going to be maybe a workout, right? That's meaningful to your conditioning, but it's not meaningful to the movement or the mobility that you're trying to change. So definitely keep that in mind. Now, I want to come back to the scaling options or some of the progressions a little bit later that you were talking about there, Dave. But before we move off the topic of, because we're kind of still on the topic of hand positioning, hand width, and specific hand placement, you say middle finger straight ahead or at 12 o'clock. We did a workout a couple weeks ago now with handstand push-ups in it, which was terrible, by the way. I think I'm still sore from that one. But well, no, it was with you. It was with you. It's one we were trying out. But what we did is that we measured our hand position in a specific way to create a standard. So this is the I guess called the Power Monkey standard, right?
Yeah.
Can you go over that a little bit, just because I think it's a great way to give people an idea of exactly the hand position that you're looking for and what you want. And, it's potentially, they're going to potentially see a similar standard, if not the exact standard, say in a CrossFit competition down the road at some point. But I love the way that you did that. And I'm definitely trying to figure out a way to steal it and use it for people's squad. And it may end up being the exact same measurement that I use. But can you go over that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And I have to say that, it wasn't just my doing here. Jordan, who's part of our team, me and him have been kind of considering this for a while. And just to take a step back before you kind of go over that, one of the things that we're trying to achieve with the setup for the handstand push-up is to make sure that the person is creating what we call a tripod position in their headstand. And if you're not creating that tripod with the handstand push-up, you're really missing out on an opportunity. And that's what we really want to kind of come back to again, is that the tripod is completely 100% necessary for the higher level version of the handstand push-up. So if you're used to doing handstand push-ups so your hands are completely up against the wall, what it does is it forces your head to be in line with your hands. If your hands are in line with your head is in line with your hands, you try to do that same thing freestanding, you're going to fall right over. There's no way that you can find stability if you have 3 points in one line. So what we're trying to do is create an equilateral triangle with our tripod, meaning our head needs to be as far away from our hands as our hands are from each other. So that's the pattern that we're trying to create. We're trying to create a position where the head goes out way further in front of your hands than you're normally accustomed to doing. And that's kind of the key to making sure the reps are correct, that's a standard that we can consistently put into place, and that it's in place for a higher level version, freestanding, deficit, whatever it might be, later down the road that you might try to achieve. So part one is finding your correct shoulder width. So everyone's distance away from the wall is going to be dictated according to their shoulder width. So for someone whose shoulders are very wide, that gives you a little bit more play room to be able to place your hands, and it also gives you some more distance away from the wall. For someone who's a little bit more narrow in their shoulders, your hands are going to be a little bit closer together. Your hands are going to be a little closer to the wall. So what we have to do first is measure the distance of the shoulders. So whatever that distance is from shoulder to shoulder, that's going to be kind of starting point. And from there, we'll be able to kind of measure, that's where the hands are going to be placed down on the ground. So that will be our distance one. Then we'll take that distance and place it out in front of the hands. And that's where the top of the head needs to be placed. Now, what we're going to try to do is move that entire triangle as close to the wall as we possibly can. So the top of the head is going to be touching the ground on that point, the front part of that triangle, but the back of the head is going to be very, very close to the wall. And the rep will only count if the top of the head is touching that front part of the triangle on every rep, and the hands are being placed at the distance of your shoulder width. So what this does is it gives everyone a correct position to start from. It's not just a box to be able to say your hands have to stay within this box. It's not a heel position, because I know that if your hands are in this place and your head is touching this place, that you're creating a good position, and it doesn't require you to have to worry about anything that's going up against the wall. So really what we're trying to reinforce is what's happening down on the ground, and that needs to be perfected. If we can get the hands to be shoulder width, and we can get that same distance to be where you put your head down on the ground, that's going to give us a pattern that's going to be needed to be recreated when we're doing our freestanding versions, when we're doing our headstand and such. So those are what we're looking for. Shoulder width apart, measured shoulder to shoulder. We can even kind of go through the back part of the shoulder around. That's where the hands will be placed. Normally what we do is we give 2 inches on the outside of that shoulder width as well for the hands to be placed. Mm-hmm. And then from there, that's where we want the measurement to be for the top of the head as well.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember exactly how we measured this up against the wall. I know that I laid down and I had my wife Jody come mark the edges of my shoulder when I was laying on the ground. I can't remember if my head was touching the wall or if it was a certain distance, but I'm trying to get the listeners a good visual of what we did here. I was laying on my back. We measured the outside of my shoulders, and what was the other part of that?
So yeah, you'll measure the outside of the shoulders, and your head will be very close to the wall, but not touching. So okay. That's kind of where you want to be. But again, that part of it needs to be just adjusted. When you find your shoulder width, that's going to be kind of your starting point, and then we'll measure, take that same distance, and then measure it out to where your head needs to be placed eventually. So where your head is placed on the wall will be dictated more according to the shoulder width that you find down on the ground. So laying down on the ground, mark the outside of the shoulder. That will be where your hands will be placed. You get 2 inches on the outside of that to place your hands if you want to go slightly wider than that. And then from there, you'll place the point for the top of your head where it needs to go.
Right. And that strict standard, once you make that measurement, you tape it down, you have that little box that you can go off of. You give that 2 inches, as you said, of range. So that means that their pinky finger on each side can't go outside of that box, right?
Yeah, essentially. Yep. And really, it should be more of a triangle than a box. So what I'd really love to see is that eventually we get to a point where it's not just kind of a box where your hands go, but hand, head, 3 points, so that every time. What it also does is the person doing the movement, it gives them the ability to kind of have a target to shoot for. So as they fatigue, they have a visual target to say, okay, where does my head need to be going to make sure that my pattern stays in place? So I actually use that a lot when I'm just working with people who are starting out with handstand push-ups too, because it reinforces the importance of making sure the head goes far enough out, and it also reinforces the elbow staying in by having a visual target of that top part of the triangle being out in front of them. So it's a nice way for people as they fatigue to make sure that the position is staying intact.
Awesome. And to kind of go along with that, one of the things that you talk a lot about too is really spreading the fingers out. So one problem I see with this, if we don't mention it, I think because I did the exact same thing whenever I kicked up against the wall and I was trying to keep my hands inside of the boxes, my fingers were all together because I was trying to keep the edge of that pinky inside of the box. But in reality, we want to spread the fingers out as much as possible, correct?
Yeah, I'd like to see you spread the fingers out. Again, application to a lot of their movements. If your fingers are together, it really will limit your ability to control and stabilize what's going on in the ground. You want as wide of a base as possible. So yes, I'd love you to be able to kind of spread those fingers out and have the hands into the position that we're, again, that's going to be our optimal position with those fingertips nice and spread. So that's going to have a lot of value to the stability side of our handstand. We don't have to worry about the stability so much when you're doing them up against the wall because the wall is your spotter. The wall is your stability. But again, we want the position to be intact, so it's always working towards something freestanding, something a little bit more challenging.
And I think that's important for people to really listen to and hear. Don't just like let that go in one ear and out the other. It should be about developing into more difficult variations as opposed to just staying up against the wall all the time. But, going back and talking about those finger spread, that's really the same thing I want in a squat too. I want you to be able to open up your toes and really be able to grip the ground with your toes and the base of those toes. And the problem is that we're always in shoes, so they're always scrunched together, which is why for me it's so important for people to get out of their shoes for some of their reps when they're warming up for the squat or when they're warming up in general. And you say that a lot too with gymnastics movement, Dave. Get out of your shoes as much as you can when you're practicing these things. And I think just a good side note to make, let's spend some time outside of our shoes, whether we're working on gymnastics or whether we're working on weightlifting. Now,
Wait,
what
wait,
I
wait.
wanted
Can I can I
to
can
get
I
in,
just can I
yep.
just add one more little comment on that because I think it's a good point. I don't think people from the weightlifting side. I mean, how often are you suggesting people to do their lifts outside of their shoes?
I recommend that they do. So I always recommend a squat warm up sequence, which takes about 10 to 15 minutes. I recommend that they do all of that squat warm up sequence as their general warm up without their shoes on. And then I want them to do the first 2 or 3 sets, depending on the person, depending on their capability and stuff like that, the first 2 or 3 sets of whatever exercise they're doing first without their shoes on. So maybe that's a snatch, maybe that's a squat, maybe that's a clean or a jerk, whatever that is. So they have some exposure with a little bit of weight and they get the benefit of that movement that's a little bit more difficult because they don't have their shoes on.
Love that. I love that. And I just want to make it very clear that if you are working on handstands, if you're working on gymnastics movements and they are new to you and you're working them from a skill perspective to try to improve your movement, you should never have your shoes on. You should never have your shoes on. All right. It's not something that adds any value. It's not going to make the movement easier. In fact, it's going to make it much more challenging. It's going to make it much more difficult to understand what your body is doing within that movement. So if you are learning something from a skills perspective, not necessarily in a WOD where you need to maybe go from one movement to the other where shoes is going to be beneficial and you're running or whatever else might be. If you're working on your handstand push-ups, you're working on your planks, you're working on your muscle-ups, you're working on your strict pull-ups, take your shoes off. That additional weight, especially at the end of your lever, the end of the body on your feet, is going to make the skill much more challenging than it needs to be. It might not seem like that weight is playing a huge role, but it's significant. You want to be able to understand what your body is doing in a true sense of what body weight is supposed to feel like. And you can only do that if the shoes are off. If you go into a gymnastics gym, what are gymnasts wearing when they're training? Almost nothing, right? We have a pair of shorts on, and that's basically it, right? And we need to be able to understand how to move our body properly. Any additional weight is taking away from our ability to do that movement properly. So please understand that taking the shoes off plays a huge role in you being able to understand how to move through the movement better. So it's just a pet peeve of mine that I want to make sure we reiterate. Take the shoes off when you're doing handstands, when you're doing ring work, when you're doing bar work. Take them off, especially when you're learning. They are not necessary. They're not helping you. In fact, they're probably hurting you.
And that's probably why I snuck it in there, Dave, because I know how much that irritates you. But it irritates. What irritates me in the same way is when athletes are only wearing nanos or whatever shoe that they're wearing that's not a weightlifting shoe that's made for squatting. That's the heel elevation and the solidity is made for squatting. It's made for the Olympic lifts. So the basic that I think people need to work on is perfecting their squat and their Olympic lifts inside of weightlifting shoes and barefoot, and doing less, as little as they can in that regular shoe. So to me, it's skipping steps in the same way that you're skipping steps and trying to do all your handstand push-ups, for example, with shoes on as well. The better you get without shoes on in a handstand push-up or a handstand, the more you'll be capable with those shoes on. So look at that as skipping step in the same way as trying to get good in your squat with weightlifting shoes and barefoot. Because if you're only ever doing warm-ups and squats and Olympic lifts with the regular shoes on, then more than likely, and unless you're Matt Frazier, because Matt Frazier's done enough Olympic lifting to where he can get away with doing heavy Olympic lifts with regular shoes on. But unless you're, way less than 1% of the population, you're going to always be compensated in the reception of your snatch and clean without that solid shoe on and without getting some exaggerated work without the shoe on.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So what I want to go into now, Dave, is kipping versus strict. In my mind, I know that when you were talking through all this stuff that we've talked about already through the last, I think we've been on here for 50 minutes. I can't believe it's been 50 minutes already, Dave, but all the stuff that we've talked about, in your mind, you're seeing strict handstand push-ups, right? I know that the listeners are thinking probably about kipping handstand push-ups. So let's compare those real quick, if you don't mind.
Sure. Simple. Strict, good. Kipping, bad.
Yeah. For sure.
So this is a conversation that, we have a lot whenever we're doing our seminars and things like that, especially people who are more on the competitive side who need to learn how to do it or want to understand some efficiency when it comes to kipping handstand push-up for competitive setting. I don't do kipping handstand push-ups. I don't really teach kipping handstand push-ups. I don't find kipping handstand push-ups to have very much value. And primarily from the perspective of most people who are doing kipping handstand push-ups are doing them in place of a strict handstand push-up because they can use the momentum to make up for any strength that they're lacking. So what ends up happening is I'm replacing strength with momentum. Now let's think about what's happening there. If you don't have the strength to do strict handstand push-ups and you're inverted and you're coming down right onto your head and you don't have the control to be able to lower yourself down, you're putting an extraordinary amount of stress onto your neck and onto your head and onto your spine. Over time, you might be able to get away with this with 1, 3, 5, 10 reps. As soon as you start adding a lot of volume and that compression onto your spine, it is 100% completely unnecessary for you to be able to do things for longevity and with quality of life in mind. So I will always recommend someone working primarily on strict handstand push-up variations. Almost no one needs to be doing kipping handstand push-ups. In fact, I would highly recommend people who are programming handstand push-ups in competition to take out kipping handstand push-ups. I don't think that they have very much value even for the athletes that are doing in a competitive setting. Why I say that is because I've done a couple of kipping handstand push-ups in some WODs, and my strict handstand push-up is pretty good. It's pretty good compared to most people.
Very good, yeah.
I have some pretty good strength when it comes to being able to do that exercise. And every time that I've done kipping handstand push-ups, I've walked away with a sore neck. And I always say, why am I doing these? Like, what am I doing? Well, just because I can go through that a couple seconds faster by doing the kipping variation. What's happening with someone that does not have the strength that I have? What's happening when they're doing the same number of reps that I'm doing? What's going on with their neck and their spine and their head going through that position? So it always just is coming from a caution standpoint, and making sure people are not skipping steps. I just don't see where the value is in terms of long-term health, in terms of longevity. For one, definitely don't skip the step of having a good strict handstand push-up before attempting a kipping handstand
Hmm.
push-up. If you're needing a kipping handstand push-up for a high-level competitive setting, okay, we can talk about that and see where the value is and making sure
Hmm.
that you have so many prerequisites in place that you can actually do it safely. But for someone who's just in the gym, kind of going through daily workouts in the gym for quality of life, to be able to play with their kids a little bit better and to be able to move better,
Hmm.
kipping handstand push-ups should not be part of your training. Sorry to
I
say
love
that.
it. So you're saying, no, yeah, yeah, and that's going to hurt a lot of people. I know a lot of people probably have a little bit of difficulty wrapping their mind around that. But you're saying in an ideal world, nobody would do kipping handstand push-ups. But for those out there that know right now, if it comes up, if it's written on the board in a WOD in CrossFit class or whatever they're doing, to get through the workout faster, to get more reps in, they know that they're going to do kipping handstand push-ups. What can we say to them? What can we say? Can we bargain with them a little bit? And maybe you don't bargain on this, which is fine, because there are certain things in weightlifting that I don't either.
Mm-hmm.
But can we say that if you will at least do more strict handstand push-ups than you do kipping, we can be okay with that? And certainly for the person that when they do handstand push-ups or when they think handstand push-ups, all that comes to mind is a kipping handstand push-ups. And so all their handstand push-ups are always kipping. Can we at least motivate them to start thinking about that a little bit differently?
Yeah, I think one is, we glossed over, is just understanding proper scaling options and like being good at
Right.
some other variations. I don't want to like deter people from wanting to do handstand pushes because it's challenging. Like the challenge should be the fun
Right.
part. You know what I mean? Like that should be part of
Yep.
the process, because if you are able to achieve something challenging, the path to get there is really satisfying. So, appreciating that process and taking pride in that process is part of the fun and becoming good at something that, you thought you'd never be able to do. And really, our approach and everything we do with Power Monkey is trying to have people do things with quality for the rest of their lives. And it's really one of the things that I think both of us and everyone that, all the other coaches on our staff really try to stress. We take less of approach in terms of how to do things quickly and get the best time out of something. And I know there are a lot of people that go into a workout with that's the primary concern. The primary concern is, am I going to beat the person next to me? Am I going to beat this time
Mm-hmm.
versus the last time that I did this workout? And there's less concern placed on, am I going to be able to do this workout 5 years from now? And
Yep.
that's always the concern that I have whenever we're working on a specific movement pattern and pattern quality, and doing things for longevity should always be kind of at the forefront of the mind, and not so much the speed of the action. And I think we hear that a lot, but we don't see it in action nearly enough. So, and just specifically with handstand push-ups, because of the nature of the movement where you're dropping down onto your head, there's just a lot
Mm-hmm.
more things than that can potentially go wrong, that kind of worry me when it comes to someone that doesn't have the strength and the movement pattern to be able to control what's going on, as opposed to maybe like, a butterfly pull-up or something like that, where, we can have further discussions, or we have had further discussions, kipping pull-ups,
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that. But just the nature of the handstand push-up where someone's coming down on their head with, very little control, just is something that I think people need to be a little bit more aware of in terms of having the prerequisites in place.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good place to take us into maybe the final topic that we'll cover here today. Today, Dave, is talking about some of those progressions that you talked about, scaling, and specifically, when does someone know that they're ready to go from a scaling option and start to kick up against the wall and try to do some handstand push-ups? And then on the other side of that, again, we want the goal to be to go beyond doing push-ups up against the wall. We want them to think about maybe someday doing a freestanding handstand push-up. So when do people know that they're ready to go from scaling to kicking up against a wall, and from kicking up against a wall to starting to try to do them freestanding?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, there are a couple things that I would note here. One is that scaling options to me should kind of serve a few different purposes. One, the scaling option should try to mimic the same movement pattern that you're trying to achieve at the highest level of the version of this movement. So when it comes to like a handstand push-up, the positioning of the elbows, the positioning of the fingers, the positioning of the tripod, where the head is going, should have the same pattern that they're trying to do with the highest level version. So, if you're doing like a wall walk to scale for a handstand push-up, it's a missed opportunity. That doesn't have very much value to what the actual skill is you're trying to achieve. So the movement pattern needs to mimic what you're trying to do for that eventual movement. Another thing that I like to see, it's not super critical because there are other variations you can do in here, but the more you can add in full ranges of motion with your scaling options, the more you're going to be able to understand what the full range looks like at its eventual movement. So I would like you to be able to not only always just shorten the range to be able to use as a scaling option. So instead of saying, I'm always going to put 4 ab mats up against the wall so that my range is shortened when doing the handstand push-up, that's not really the optimal way to be able to scale. Shortening the range can help if it's done for a specific reason, but I really want to incorporate other variations on top of that that allow for full ranges of motion to be in place so that your muscle activation can be such that it applies to what it's going to actually look like when you actually do the full variation again. So those two things I really want to make sure are clear whenever anyone is applying a scaling option to any movement, not just specifically for handstand push-up. Good movement pattern that applies to the eventual movement, and 2, trying to work through full ranges of motion as much as you possibly can. Now, a couple of the variations. The first one we already mentioned, more push-ups. I think more push-ups, and for a lot of people, push-ups in general are going to go a long way if handstand push-ups come up in a workout. Now, what you can do with that is you can kind of supplement it, and you can say, okay, I'm going to hold a handstand for 10 seconds, and then I'm going to do the push-ups, and combine movements. And you can kind of do things in conjunction with one another. You can also start working on variations that slowly start to get you more and more inverted. You can get into the downward dog or the pike handstand push-up. And if anyone's ever done that, any listeners has ever done a pike handstand push-up, they'll know that it's freaking hard. It's actually a really, really challenging movement. It's not something that's easy to do, but it does, again, mimic the good pattern that we'll be seeing. It gets a good muscle activation, especially from those triceps, and you'll be feeling the same kind of pattern that you'll be doing inverted. Now, my recommendation would be that if that person's not able to do that, you can use that same pike variation in the same pattern, but just shorten the lever. And this is one of the ones that I think translates really well to the tripod position for most people, if you can do it and understand the pattern here. So what you do is start in a pike position, lowering down to your knees first, then to the tripod position, then pushing back up with straight arms, then coming off of your knees into that deep pike. So basically the start and finish is exactly the same as a pike handstand push-up, starting from the feet and from the hands with the hips nice and high. The only variation, though, is now you're shortening the lever by coming to your knees and then the top of the head and back up. So you're coming to the knees to be able to complete the movement. It's like doing a knee push-up, but instead you're doing a knee pike handstand push-up. And I think it's one of those variations that would be highly beneficial for most people to incorporate into their patterning for their handstand push-up eventually. Another thing that we kind of didn't mention, but just strict dumbbell press and working on those from a seated position. Now, when you're doing a seated dumbbell press, one of the things that we really want to be considering here is what the elbow positioning are doing. And a good indication that you're in the right position with the tripod is that your elbow is at 90 degrees. And that's one of the things that we didn't mention yet, but it's a good indication that your head is out far enough to be able to maximize the stability component of it. If that angle is much shorter, it means your head is close to your hands. If that angle is much larger than 90, it means your head is way too far out in front of the hands. So we're trying to mimic a position where the elbows are at 90 degrees when we're in that headstand. So one of the ways that we can kind of work on that is with dumbbells in hand. If you're at dumbbells in hand, most people will work on their strict press with the elbows all the way down by their sides and where the dumbbells themselves are kind of in line with the shoulder. Now, that's okay, but what that's really mimicking more is more of a deficit position because the head is not in line with the hands here. It's more like if you're on parallettes and doing a shoulder stand, if you're on rings and doing a shoulder stand. So it's important to get strong there, but it's not really mimicking the same pattern that you'd be doing if you were in a handstand. So what I prefer people to be doing if they were doing a strict dumbbell press is to actually raise the elbows up and start in a position where the hands are in line with the head and where the elbows are at 90 degrees. And working on a pressing position that mimics a little bit more of what they'd be doing if their head is actually coming down to the ground. That pattern is going to be a little bit more effective to get that in place for the eventual movement that they're going to be doing, downward dog, pike handstand push-up, elevated or handstand push-up, as opposed to coming to a dumbbell press where the hands are all the way down by the shoulders. So understand that they're both beneficial, but they have different equivalency in terms of what they're training towards. So for me, those are really good kind of stepping stones. And then working on that elevation. And the elevation one is something that I think will have tons of benefit for most people. Starting with the feet, on a lower box, and then slowly building that height higher and higher, getting more and more weight on top of the shoulders, more comfortable getting inverted, and then eventually getting to that full inverted handstand push-up. A missing step here is doing stomach to wall variations. Now that if you ever have stall bars in your gym, or if you ever have that wall of rungs up against the wall that you would see in like old school gymnastics gyms, they have a ton of value. I highly recommend you guys investing in stall bars if you don't have them already in your gym. But one of the things I would normally do if I do have someone I'm working with in my class and we do have stall bars available is to use the rungs as kind of checkpoints to be able to get more and more inverted. You would place your feet basically stomach to wall facing the stall bars, place your feet on the rungs, and then next week try to go up one rung and then up another rung, and it'll get you closer and closer to a full inverted position and allow you to be working on a nice angled position as you come through that headstand. So it allows someone to feel like their stepping stones are happening more incrementally rather than making any dramatic jumps. So if you can feel like you're getting more and more inverted over time, it will feel like it's happening more kind of incrementally rather than anything too drastic. And that's what we want. We want more progressions. We want to have the ability to kind of incorporate more of these scaling options as opposed to saying, got my push-up good, I'm ready to do a handstand push-up. That's not really the case. It's not really the thing I want people to be thinking about in terms of applying a scaling option. The last thing I'll mention is that not one scaling option is right for everyone. Meaning that when you're working on your handstand push-ups, you should incorporate a variety of scaling options into your training to tackle it from different directions. So if you're doing a scaling option with handstand push-ups one week and you're using the downward dog, the next variation I would like to see is maybe next week we go back to the dumbbell press and increase the weight on the dumbbell press and see if we can focus on that pattern a little bit more. And to tackle it from different directions so that you can kind of appreciate why each of the scaling options has value. So it's not just staying at one for a long time until they become good at it and then jumping to the next. It's kind of an application of different scaling options on top of each other so you can tackle the eventual movement from different directions.
Yeah, I love that. That's great, mixing it up. And again, we have to go back to if the handstand push-up is something you really want to improve, there's got to be frequency there. And in that frequency, mixing up and doing some of these different things. I love the dumbbell variation that you talk about, Dave, and specifying it to the handstand by placing your hands and your elbows in a specific place. And what I wonder with that, and I think a question that you would get, and maybe you do get this question, is that do they hold the dumbbells with their palms facing each other or with their palms facing away? And in that regard, could they also do this with a barbell?
Yes, so that's a really good point. So again, what's the application? So if you have dumbbells in hand, your palms are facing each other, that's equating more to being on parallettes, right? Where the hand is turned out. Now, if you're doing it and you're turning the dumbbells in, the key is not letting the elbows go out, right? So you want to be feeling like you're pulling everything in to be able to work on that same type of pressing position that would mimic what we do inverted. So one of the things that we could potentially do is do it with plates. Do it with plate, which would put your hand flat, which would mimic the same type of hand position that we'd be doing if we were actually inverted. So you could be starting with something very light, a little change plate, and then eventually go up in weight and be working in that same position where the hand is flat as opposed to working with a dumbbell, which changes the hand position. So I do think there's value in working on both variations, but make sure that you're understanding that the elbows need to continue to stay in by the sides no matter where the hands are.
Awesome. I love that, holding that plate. And that just reminded me too, as we're wrapping up here, I want to reinforce the importance of athletes working on their wrist mobility and strength while they're working on their handstands if they're doing this on a regular basis. And I know you'll agree with that, Dave, but what I want to just reinforce here is that, basically all this stuff that we talked about, that triangle, creating that triangle and taping it out so you have something solid to know where you need to put your head. And that's whether you're doing a handstand push-up on the wall, or whether you're doing a downward dog, or your legs or your knees are on boxes, wall facing, scaling options, and also wrist exercises. We'll make sure that we have some links that we can direct you guys to in the description section, so you can help your handstand push-up and handstand as much as possible. Now, last question I have for you, Dave, is when you're talking about these standards that you want, the hands being placed in a certain position, the head being able to go out a certain amount with that triangle that we talked about, with all the people that you've come across, do you feel like in general they have been immediately, and if not immediately, shortly after or down the road at some point, more capable to do these things than they think they would be?
At first, it's like pulling teeth. At first, it's a really hard thing for most people to change. They're really hesitant to do it. In fact, whenever I'm teaching my seminars, I always have to make a comment prior saying, this will be the biggest change that I'm going to ask of you out of anything that we go over. Any ring work, any bar work, any other handstand work. The handstand push-up change is really the one that people are most hesitant to want to do, because it feels so dramatic. It feels so challenging to them. And to me, it comes back to, one, because they've done so many a particular way, but two, because their triceps are weak. They haven't done enough push-up work. So as soon as you start to put them in a position where they need a lot of tricep activation and the tricep is not there and it requires much more of just the front part of the shoulder, it's not something that they feel capable of doing. Like, I was able to do 10 handstand push-ups, no problem, and now I can't do one. Why? Well, it's because now you're activating a muscle group that has not been activated. So it's very frustrating for people initially to change position. But if we can, the key to making people kind of find value in it is showing the application and where it's beneficial later down the road. And most people, if I can describe it to them, they understand, okay, I get where we're trying to go with this. I get that we're working towards a higher level variation. I get that it has value later down the road. So I'm willing to kind of make that change for the better. But don't expect these things to change kind of overnight or in a week. It's going to take some time, just because it took you time to kind of build this ingrained poor pattern that we're having to break down, and also get new muscles to become strong.
Love it. Love it. And like I said in the beginning, love handstand push-ups. And do you have any parting words, Dave? What's going on with Power Monkey? Anything coming up that we can talk about?
With the handstand push-ups, I will say that we just talked for over an hour, and I didn't even get to all of my points with handstand push-ups. So that means that handstand push-ups are going to have a second episode, which is, I don't know if people are going to listen to it, but I like talking about these things. It's amazing that we talked an hour already. What's going on with Power Monkey is a ton of stuff. To be honest with you, we are really in some exciting, working on some exciting projects right now that we're not quite ready to fully unveil to everyone yet. But right now, my recommendation is to go to a couple of different sites, our powermonkeyfitness.com website, where we have information for you guys to be able to sign up to our Monkey Method app. Our Monkey Method app has all of our programs, gymnastics and weightlifting. They are individual purchase plans. We are adding a subscription service in the next couple of weeks, so kind of keep an eye out for that. And then on top of that, I would highly recommend checking out powermonkeyfitness.teachable.com for our live sessions that we've been doing since this quarantine set in. And we're going to be continuing kind of upgrading the services that go along with that. We have weekly sessions of weightlifting and gymnastics, and a bunch that Chad and I are going to be unveiling for 4-week smaller group session live sessions as well. You can go on there right now and sign up for a Handstand Essentials, which is basically 4 weeks, 3 days a week. So 12 total sessions of working with me on handstands live. And then Chad, what is your 4-week weightlifting?
It's a clean and jerk, but the focus for this 4 weeks is going to be more jerk, and then transition that into clean, and then putting the clean and jerk together. So yeah, it's all about one of the I think some of the best feedback that we've gotten is that they appreciate and they like the slow progression that we're able to apply over the course of those 12 sessions. So we're not cramming everything into 4 hours in one day, for example, but rather we're spreading things out in a progressive manner. So that's what, it's clean and jerk, but it's really focusing on the jerk and progressing through that, and then adding the clean as we can.
Awesome. Yep. So again, guys, that's at powermonkeyfitness.teachable.com. You can find the information on there. If you have any questions, just email me or chat, and we'll be able to kind of answer all those questions for you. Hopefully you can sign up.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Dave, before we started recording, we've all been probably a little more busier overall with everything that's been put on hold, and while we're all more at home than we are traveling. So lots of really exciting, cool things coming your way, guys. We're working hard and we're loving every minute of it at the same time. But as Dave mentioned, powermonkeyfitness.com. Also be sure to check out Instagram, Power Monkey Fitness, Dave Durante, and at Ollie Chad. And if you aren't sure how to get a hold of us, a direct message there for me specifically. That's where I think I get most of my messages is on Instagram. So don't be afraid to reach out there. Also, guys, we'd love to hear from you. Any feedback that you have, any recommendations that you might have for who you want us to have on, anything that you want us to talk about, you can shoot us a message at podcast@powermonkeyfitness.com as well. And on behalf of Power Monkey Fitness, we're your host. I'm Chad Vaughn with Dave Durante. And until next time, guys, thank you all for listening.